The United States Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC, is tasked with protecting people and the environment from the health ravages of nuclear radiation. They held a 90-minute telephone conference to assure those who called in that everything was under control with the nuclear sector in the face of the health ravages of COVID-19. But immediately after the call, when a genuine nuclear expert like Gunter of Beyond Nuclear tells you,
one of the big concerns that we have that did not get addressed and was not even raised is the continued operations of nuclear power stations in a pandemic, when in fact emergency planning for an accident that coincides with a pandemic is simply out of the question. You can't plan evacuation reasonably when populations around nuclear power stations are already being sheltered in place. You're adding the consequence of exposure to COVID-19 to avoidance of exposure to radiation.
Well, when you hear it spelled out that clearly from someone who's been on the front lines of the battle against nuclear for decades, you know that you are in that awful seat that we all share.
Nuclear hot seat, what are those people thinking? Nuclear hot seat, what have those boys been drinking? Nuclear hot seat, the corium is sinking. Our time to act is shrinking, but our activists are linking. Nuclear hot seat, it's the bomb.
Welcome to Nuclear Hot Seat, the weekly international news magazine keeping you up to date on all things nuclear from a different perspective. My name is Libby Halevi. I'm the producer and host, as well as a survivor of the nuclear accident at 3 Mile Island from just 1 mile away. So I know what can happen when those nuclear so-called experts get it wrong. This week, another special update on the novel coronavirus, COVID-19, and its impact upon the nuclear industry, along with possible problems that have not yet been examined. We talk with Gunter of Beyond Nuclear on what the NRC skipped or skimmed over in its 90-minute feeble feel-good call on Friday, March 20th. We talk with Eric Epstein of 3 Mile Island Alert on how COVID-19 may be impacting the decommissioning of 3 Mile Island and what's going to happen to its decades of highly radioactive spent fuel. And we include an excerpt from the conference call demonstrating how the NRC handled questions by Kevin Kamps of Beyond Nuclear instead of addressing themselves to the issues he raised. We will also have nuclear news from around the world and more honest nuclear information than anyone, any outlet in the mainstream media world is currently covering. All of it coming up right now. Today is Tuesday, March 24th, 2020, and here is this week's nuclear news from a different perspective. First, word out of Japan. Under international pressure from governments, athletes, and Olympic governing bodies, the 2020 radioactive Tokyo Olympics have been postponed. As for the Olympic torch relay, which was scheduled to begin on Thursday, March 26, when the flame first landed in Japan, close to 200 people gathered to watch, and pictures of the crowd showed children with no masks or other protections from the coronavirus. When the flame was displayed in Sendai, which is only 66 kilometers or 41 miles from Fukushima, close to 52,000 people stood in line for hours, waiting for 1 minute where they could take a selfie with the flame. Only as of late Monday, March 23rd, was it announced that the torch relay would not be canceled, but downsized to a lit lantern in a car that drives the route with no runners, no torches, and no spectators. Next, I predict it will be turned into a big lighter in a clown car and will be canceled as soon as it has gone through Fukushima for 3 days, just to show how quote-unquote recovered things are. In a side note, Prime Minister Abe has announced that he will not be attending the torch relay. I wonder why. The novel coronavirus is making inroads quickly into the staff at nuclear facilities around the world. In the UK, at the Sellafield nuclear site in Cumbria, about 1,000 employees are self-isolating after a first staff member has tested positive coronavirus and another employee with suspected COVID-19 had begun self-isolation. In France, EDF, the country's national nuclear operator, has reported that 3 workers at nuclear power plants had tested positive for the virus, and it was reducing the staff at the plant from 800 to 100. The company is also introducing stricter hygiene procedures at its nuclear plants after walkouts by a number of workers who feared getting infected with coronavirus during radiation screening. After working in the radioactive areas of nuclear plants, staff have to step through narrow shower-style portals in their underwear to be checked for possible radiation exposure. Workers feared the surfaces of these portals could become a source for spreading the virus, so EDF has now agreed to clean the portal a big old twice per 8-hour shift. At the Savannah River site near Aiken, South Carolina, the first confirmed case was disclosed on Monday, March 23rd, and now 67 employees are currently being tracked. At the Y-12 complex near Oak Ridge, Tennessee, there has been one confirmed case of a person with COVID-19, and other employees who have been in contact with the affected employee have been asked to self-quarantine. According to Michael Schneider, energy and nuclear policy independent analyst, COVID-19 constitutes an unprecedented threat on the sensitive strategic infrastructure above all the power sector. Operation and maintenance of nuclear power plants draws on a small group of highly specialized technicians and engineers, which makes its power supply system extremely vulnerable to a genuine public health crisis like the COVID-19 pandemic. We will have much more about this aspect of the threat during our interview segments, which we will have in just a few moments. But first, it seems that there is only one story in the news this week across the world: the novel coronavirus, COVID-19, and its inexorable progress through humanity. But as this week's program will show you, there is much more to the problems raised by this invisible assault on health and life. The other, more long-lasting assault of nuclear radioactivity on health and life. It travels a much longer, slower timeline than COVID-19, but ultimately, it's just as deadly, if not more so, because it damages the DNA of the human race, which damages all our futures. Thus far, we don't believe the virus has that kind of longevity, but we know for a fact that nuclear radiation does. Nuclear Hot Seat is the one place you can come to learn the ongoing, evolving truth about the COVID-19 nuclear connection. And as you'll hear, attention must be paid if we're to avoid setting ourselves up for an even worse, longer-lasting calamity. And in order to do that, I need to keep the show going. And to keep the show going, I need your help. The best way you can do that right now is to help with a donation so we can keep getting the word out. We make it easy for you to do. Just go to nuclearhotseat.com. You might have to scroll down a little to see the big red donate button to send a donation of any size. And to send us a monthly $5 donation, just click on the big green donate button at nuclearhotseat.com. Please do what you can now so we can keep bringing you the news. And know that whatever you can do, you've got my gratitude. Here are this week's featured interviews. On Friday, March 20th, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission held a 90-minute conference call on the impact of coronavirus on the U.S. nuclear industry. They, of course, tried to downplay any dangers, give assurances that they were on top of things, and stopped just short of, there, Missy, don't worry your pretty little head about it, we've got this, no matter what they were asked. It seemed more a PR exercise than a genuine information session. Several frontliners who oppose nuclear were on the call, and all of them got foofed around. So to gain a sharper perspective on what was and wasn't said during that phone call, I first spoke with Paul Gunter, head of Beyond Nuclear, to get his response to the NRC call. We talked just moments after the call ended on Friday, March 20th, 2020. Paul Gunter, it's great that you could join us here on Nuclear Hot Seat.
Thank you very much, Libby. It's an honor to be on. But unfortunately, these are really hard times to be addressing issues with nuclear power that are decades old now. And they've still not been answered by evidence of this conversation we just had with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission.
Right. I should let listeners know that we were just on a 90-minute call with the NRC that was purportedly to address the COVID-19 impact upon the industry and the operation and what they are doing within the NRC. What was your impression of the call?
The basic impression that anybody listening to this call would be that the NRC has been sitting on its hands on the whole issue of pandemic disease and readiness for the nuclear industry. You know, nuclear power is not a passively safe industry. It requires particularly critical decision making by human operators. For example, we have known since 2007, when a report came out from at least a half a dozen nuclear utilities that was entitled The Microbiological Threat to National Power Grid Advanced Pandemic Planning for Utility Executives, that the prospect of a pandemic is not widely cast as a true strategic matter in the energy utility sector. That's a quote from 6 of the nation's nuclear utility operators. What we're seeing now, 13 years later, following this NRC briefing, demonstrates precisely that the agency and the industry have been avoiding critical decisions relative to how we can continue to assure reliable operation and delivery of electricity from nuclear power stations in the event of a long-standing, widespread pandemic. And what they conveyed to us is that not only have they been avoiding decisions, but they remain overly confident and hopefully reliant on a positive outcome without really doing their homework. That's disturbing, considering that we didn't get some good answers to the questions that we have that were asked in 2007, Libby. That's what's really outstanding here.
What are some of those questions? Because what was clear from the call is that the NRC is planning as best possible to keep nuclear reactors running. They are assuming that things will be taken care of, and they didn't have a lot of specifics, but they seem to be, might I say, optimistic in their assessment. What came out of that call that you see as what the NRC is planning to do to keep them running, and what are the difficulties when staffing levels inevitably fall?
Well, I think the overarching discussion that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission staff had with the Nuclear Energy Institute, which is the nuclear industry's chief lobby organization here in Washington, D.C., and some of the chief officers for major utilities like NextEra and Entergy, who were on the call, is that the industry can be assured that the agency is going to exercise enforcement discretion for violations of technical specifications and even safety regulations. That was my takeaway. The agency relaying confidence to industry concerns that they may not be able to meet adequate staffing levels because of chronic and sustained and growing absenteeism of nuclear operators. You can't virtually operate a nuclear power plant from a remote location. Control rooms are confined environments. You know, another one of the questions that I had that didn't get answered is that, again, back in 2007, one of the chief concerns and questions that was raised 13 years ago about pandemic disease and nuclear power plant operations are the nuclear power stations going to be stockpiled with enough personnel protective equipment like face masks, like respirators, so that they can operate in confined environments like control rooms and keep their operators safe? Well, the NRC said that's not our bailiwick. That's not my responsibility. They passed the buck off to OSHA. But in fact, having reliable, healthy, well-staffed control rooms who are not overworked because of staff shortages is in fact a safety issue. It is a public health and safety issue. And the NRC could not assure the public in this March 20th, 2020 phone call in the midst of a growing pandemic that nuclear power stations were adequately stockpiled with protective equipment for its own operators. They also could not answer another question that I had that regarded whether or not they would be sequestering control room operators to replace the sick ones. What we're seeing now, particularly in the medical community, is that, and it's a challenge even with sequestering, they are putting doctors and nurses in so they protect them so that they can bring them in at critical times. But similarly to the medical community, there's just not enough nuclear power plant operators out there to potentially replace the sick ones as they fall to COVID-19. We didn't gain any public confidence out of this conversation with the nuclear regulatory industry because it appears that the industry and the agency have been basically wishfully thinking that these are tabletop exercises and would never be necessary. And now we are in a time when it is going to be critical that we maintain enough qualified operators in nuclear power stations across the country, and at the same time, keep the operating standards at least to regulatory requirements, and we don't have confidence that that's going to happen.
It sounded to me, and they were using a lot of acronyms that were going past quickly, so I may have misunderstood this, but it sounded like they were willing to grant exemptions for people who perhaps had retired or their operating licenses had expired, or somehow that they were going to be calling back in people who perhaps had either gotten past their use-by date within the industry or perhaps did not have the full training. Was I correct in hearing that floating in the air?
There was a good bit of vagary in what was spelled out in this conference call, but the whole issue of enforcement discretion could very well apply to operating licenses, and the fact that if we were to see a pandemic that could run 18 months or longer, that during that time frame, the operators' licensing permits will expire, that they could be waived in terms of upgrades or relicensing for those reactor operators. Yes, you were accurate in hearing that. But again, Libby, none of this is written out yet. Enforcement discretion is exactly what it implies. It's discretionary to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. It's not going to be written down anywhere. It's going to be something that is free-flowing and without limit. We have seen enforcement discretion, for example, used on safety issues in nuclear power stations that have been extended for as long as 10 years, where the plant, many plants, dozens of nuclear power stations were provided with waivers on compliance with fire safety regulations for protecting electrical cable necessary to keep the power plants safe for shutdown modes during a fire. And they were able to sustain those non-compliances for decades. So now we're talking about extending that kind of discretionary non-enforcement to a whole host of conditions where nuclear power stations are not meeting their technical requirements or regulatory requirements for such things as qualified nuclear power plant operators.
If a shutdown is indicated because there aren't enough staff to safely cover operations, who has the authority and the responsibility to call it? Is this something that has to come from the utility or the NRC, or will it require a whistleblower to get on the phone and say, look, we can't do this anymore? And if it falls to the utility, how far can we trust them to say, oh, it's best if we shut down operations?
Well, again, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has been drifting steadily towards industry self-regulation, deferring regulatory decisions to industry voluntary initiatives. And I'm concerned that that same drift, based on what we heard in this telephone conference call, is continuing now into the management of safe and reliable operations of nuclear power stations during pandemics. I think that that is justified by the fact that I heard too many references to enforcement discretion rather than keeping the bar high. Again, we're dealing with an aging nuclear industry. We're talking about potentially adding a fatigued workforce from chronic and sustained absenteeism and a lackadaisical regulatory environment, and these are not public confidence builders.
There are other issues beyond the immediate staffing and safety of operating nuclear reactors, and that's at the other end of the fuel chain, which is the waste issue. And a big aspect of this that I've seen Beyond Nuclear raise in some of your email communications lately is that there are currently a series of public meetings that are scheduled in New Mexico as regards the proposed interim storage facility for high-level nuclear waste. What did the NRC say about possible schedule changes on those, given that we're not supposed to gather in groups of 10 or more?
There was nothing on this phone call with regard to that, but it's reasonable to recognize that in the middle of a pandemic, large public meetings are going to be canceled indefinitely. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission just canceled its own regulatory information conference in March, where there were 1,800 members of international regulatory bodies. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the international nuclear industry were scheduled to meet just across from NRC headquarters in Rockville, Maryland, on a host of issues for a 3-day conference that was canceled. That is in the public health interest. And I think that it's reasonable to project that public meetings on the interim storage of nuclear waste, those meetings are going to be canceled as well.
What does that do to impact certainly the push that Holtec has been doing to be able to create these? Can it move forward? Can this giving permission to Holtec move forward without public meetings being held, or are those mandated by law?
Well, I think your question prompts a reasonable request that the public should file comments to postpone Holtec decisions until those public meetings can be held.
But right now, they're on the schedule, and the assumption is that they're going to take place until such time as they are canceled.
Once those public meetings are canceled, that will undoubtedly be followed by public interest groups, including ours, who will request that the decisions by the agency on consolidated interim storage be delayed until after public hearings are completed.
And that could be a very long delay, given we don't know how long this pandemic is going to continue. What other issues were raised during that phone call, or do you think are important to be raised regarding the impact of COVID-19 on the nuclear industry and the operation of the reactors?
It's more of a concern to me what wasn't raised. That phone conference was fairly brief considering the depth and breadth of the concerns that nuclear power plant operations and pandemics raise. I mean, for example, one of the big concerns that we have that did not get addressed and was not even raised is the continued operations of nuclear power stations in a pandemic when, in fact, emergency planning for an accident that coincides with a pandemic is simply out of the question. I mean, you can't plan evacuation reasonably when populations around nuclear power stations are already being sheltered in place because of pandemic. So the continued operation of nuclear power stations, which are being operated under all kinds of riskier circumstances, does place the communities in the emergency planning zones at greater risk because they've lost the added protections under defense in depth that would have been provided if they had an evacuation. But since evacuation is going to put populations at risk of being exposed, by putting them in crowds, by putting them in stadiums after evacuation, and it raises some big questions about overall nuclear power is a very risky business, and it has extenuating consequences that raise public health and issues, and now we're laying this overlay of a pandemic simultaneously. So one of the questions that we would have liked and probably should be explored in a follow-up call is how does the pandemic and nuclear power plant operations affect emergency planning? Does it effectively nullify effective emergency management planning when resources are going to be short, when there's really no safe place to go, if in fact you're adding the consequence of exposure to COVID-19 to avoidance of exposure to radiation? So that's a big concern. The other thing is that a lot of the planning that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the nuclear industry, in this phone call, they reference these 2006, 2007 pandemic planning and guidance documents that, again, many questions have never been addressed since then and are being now raised 13 years later. But similarly, those 2006 and 2007 documents were identifying that the whole planning process really relies a lot on the development of vaccines and antiviral medicines. And again, part of the wishful thinking and overconfidence was they were referencing that these could be available quickly. Well, now 13 years later, COVID-19 basically says that we've been caught completely with a novel pandemic virus that has no vaccine, likely not available for 18 months, and no real antiviral treatment program, which are going into fast development. But still, we're talking about continued operations that will undoubtedly affect plant operations, not only the safety operations, but security, because security forces around these facilities are humans as well, and they will fall ill, and there will be chronic absenteeism among security forces around nuclear power stations. Now, that was just brushed over in this very brief hour-and-a-half telephone conference. The consequences are huge if we lose both safety and security by the fact that we can't adequately bring the workforce into these power stations, that's going to be a degrading operation. And again, we don't know how long this is going to last. So those are some of the key areas that didn't get addressed in this telephone conversation?
They seemed to be very brisk about their answers, and they didn't want to get into anything regulatory or anything complex. I really felt like they were trying to steer us away from having any serious conversation about the regulatory side of this. But Kevin Kamps from Beyond Nuclear was also on the call, and he raised the point that there are certain areas where there is a glut of electricity being generated, and perhaps it would be prudent to simply shut down the nuclear reactors in these areas because there's more electricity than can be used in the area. That was another one that got fobbed off. Any thoughts on that?
Yes. I mean, clearly what Kevin raises is, in fact, part of the solution that we should continue to press for, because with the closure of certain nuclear power stations, that would free up a very large portion of a healthy workforce that we would want to keep healthy by sequestering that population of workers so that they could be shipped to nuclear power stations that continue to operate where chronic and sustained absenteeism brings the safe operation of these more needed nuclear power plants into grids that need those operations more, so that you are creating a buffer to unreliable, unsafe operations at those more needed nuclear power stations by creating a reserve workforce and protecting their health by sequestering them in these areas of our, like New England, which is now operating at over a 50% overcapacity of nuclear power operations. So again, these are points that can be taken up in a continuing dialogue with the Nuclear Regulatory Agency to suggest that the public interest does have some suggestions that will need the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to intervene, because I don't think the nuclear industry is going to voluntarily shut down operations, but it may become necessary, which only the NRC can do. In fact, if what we need to do is preserve a buffered workforce that could be shipped into other nuclear facilities that are going to undoubtedly need reinforcements because of chronic absenteeism.
This has been very enlightening as to some of the aspects that perhaps have not been considered in general about nuclear problems created by the COVID-19 virus. Is there any other aspect of this that we haven't touched upon that you'd like to bring up now?
Yes. The other thing that didn't get covered in the telephone conference call is nuclear power plants. 100% of all safety systems in this inherently dangerous technology are initially reliant upon the continued operation of the electrical grid. 100% of the frontline safety systems for shutting down the reactor and for maintaining cooling operations require a fully operational electrical grid. So that makes the operators of the electrical grid system themselves part of the nuclear power plant operations. Similarly, the electrical grid operators are also looking at how they're going to maintain reliable operators for the electrical grid over this potentially prolonged period of stress and sickness that wasn't really figured into this telephone conversation. But the safety of nuclear power is more than reliant on just the operators. The electrical grid itself and the operators in that grid system are crucial to the continued safe operations of these atomic power plants.
Paul,
Thank you so much for the clarification of what the problems are and spelling out the extent of them beyond anything that we've considered up to this point. We will stay in touch, and until we speak again, you and everybody at Beyond Nuclear stay safe, and thanks for being my guest this week on Nuclear Hot Seat.
Thank you very much, Libby.
Paul Gunter of Beyond Nuclear. As Paul mentioned, Kevin Kamps, the radioactive waste watchdog at Beyond Nuclear, was also on the NRC call. And I wanted you to hear how he and his concerns were handled, not answered, by those representing the agency responsible for enforcing nuclear safety standards in the United States.
This is Kevin Kamps with Beyond Nuclear, and I guess my question is, given other economic sectors having to make sacrifices, whether they like it or not, like the restaurant industry, for one example, I heard Ho mention, ensuring safety, but also ensuring a reliable electricity supply. So what about areas of the country, especially that have a tremendous glut of electricity? Wouldn't it make sense to preemptively plan for shutting down high-risk atomic reactors during this pandemic where the electricity is not needed? And I guess that's my question. And a comment that I'll just add is I've heard a lot of confidence from industry and from the NRC on this call that everything's going to be okay. But during a crisis like this, shouldn't enforcement be strengthened and made more stringent, not weakened? So all of this talk of waivers and exemptions is most disconcerting to me from a public health, safety, and environmental perspective.
Hi, Kevin. It's Scott Burnell. The question of which plants should operate and which types of plants should operate are economic decisions of the utilities. And if a utility decides to continue operating its reactor, then the NRC will make sure that it's being done safely. And regarding the processes that the NRC has always had in place, any requests to modify technical specifications or offer exemptions to specific requirements are always predicated on maintaining safety. Thank you.
I think these are not economic considerations. These are safety considerations. That was my question. If it's unsafe to operate in a reactor that's not even needed, then why would you allow that to happen?
The current fleet of reactors in the United States is operating safely. And as I had mentioned earlier, if any individual plant comes to the conclusion that for whatever reason they cannot meet the relevant NRC requirements, they will likely reach the decision themselves to shut down their plant. If not, the NRC does have mechanisms in place to maintain safety.
But most of the content of this call has been about waivers and exemptions from existing regulations. So that doesn't make sense to me, what you just said. You're loosening safety requirements to allow plants to continue operating. That might not even be needed, given what Ho mentioned. There's a downturn in demand right now because industries have shut down.
Kevin, I can really empathize and appreciate the perspective that you're bringing to the conversation. In addition to what Scott is saying about the economic decision, I would just maybe offer another aspect of this is that the broader federal government takes steps to evaluate the critical infrastructure in the United States, and obviously the electricity sector is very much a part of that right now. So I think there's a broader aspect that the NRC may not by itself be able to speak to in terms of decisions related to which portions of the national critical infrastructure are the most important. I think what Scott is trying to convey here is that, we're just in an unprecedented situation here, Kevin, where, again, we recognize that there is challenges that our licensees are going to be able to face in terms of ensuring that they have the right level of staff and qualified personnel to safely operate the facility. And, where there are points of regulatory engagement, we're looking at areas that, we can consider to determine whether it is safe to continue. And again, as we mentioned before, if the NRC ever reaches a situation where we deem the condition of not being able to meet with a regulatory requirement is not safe, we have a range of regulatory instruments that we can use all the way up to an order to address that situation, and that is how we're trying to approach the current circumstances.
I would just point to news reporting by BBC a couple days ago that the Magnox reprocessing facility in Britain is shutting down preemptively, a controlled shutdown, because 8% of the workforce is already self-isolating for exposure to the virus. So it just seems prudent and wise from a safety perspective that reactors not needed right now should control shutdown and put themselves in a much safer position going forward in this time of great uncertainty and high risk.
And right after Kevin made that pertinent point about safety, there followed 15 seconds of dead silence from the NRC, followed by 7 more seconds of fumbling around before someone came on and ignored Kevin's comments to say,
I did want to say thank you to Scott and Ho for providing a response to the question, but if we could move on to the next question just to make sure everybody gets a chance to be heard.
So Kevin Kamps was, in the end, ignored and cut off. And that NRC comment about everyone being heard was a big laugh line, because as they announced at the end, when they cut off the call after 90 minutes, there were 17 callers waiting to question them. And we have no idea who they are and what they wanted to ask. If you'd like to listen to the full recording of the NRC call, it's up on our website, nuclearhotseat.com, under this episode, number 457, just in case you want to hear the frustration and the silence in real time. One other person on this NRC call was Eric Epstein of 3 Mile Island Alert. As of this Saturday, March 28th, it's the 41st anniversary of the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident, which changed my life and so many others. It seemed important to get Eric's input to the problems that this novel coronavirus poses for the already complicated decommissioning and spent fuel storage problems at 3 Mile Island. I spoke with Eric right after I got off the phone with Paul Gunter last Friday, March 20th, 2020.
Eric, I was on that call with the NRC and I heard you, and it sounded like you were pretty frustrated with what was happening.
The irony is that the 3 Mile Island accident actually is almost 41 years old a week today. So, the fact that they failed to look at any historic reference points, like lessons learned from 3 Mile Island or the shutdown of Peach Bottom in '87, it was frustrating. It seemed to me that the NRC was asking for a regulatory easy pass, and the commission was more than willing to grant it. We were today listening to an industry ask and appear to be granted a relaxation and liberalization of overtime, shifts, work conditions, fitness for duties, attention to detail. Unless I missed something, the industry is looking for a wholesale reduction and regulatory oversight. And what was most disturbing is that there's a lot of plants right now that are being readied for their refueling protocol. And by definition, a lot of necessary activities are delayed until refueling. And it seemed to me that the industry is gearing up for exemptions and exceptions, process exemptions, compliance exemptions. We're looking at the NRC using the terminology enforcement discretion. This is not a very positive development. I certainly don't want to alarm people, but I was deeply disturbed at how the conference went, and also the absolute unwillingness to discuss plants that have a possession-only license, or plants like TMI that are in another world between possession-only license and actual decommissioning.
And what does that mean to have a possession-only license?
At TMI-2, they went to a possession-only license after the accident. In other words, they have a license, but they're not allowed to operate a plant. That's TMI-2. TMI-1 went into that phase in September of 2019. Both plants are being ready for decommissioning, but it's a very complicated and almost absurd process. TMI-1 wants to delay their decommissioning, and they provide staffing to TMI-2.
Which of them was the one with the accident?
3 Mile Island Unit 2 is in the process of a license transfer from First Energy, which is a company that just came out of bankruptcy, to Environmental Solutions, which is a waste management company in Utah. So we will be litigating that case. They are arguing that they can clean up Unit 2 at an expedited pace and at a reduced price. We don't think that's feasible. So we're just in the beginning stages of litigation. So TMI-2 is where it was 41 years ago. It's a highly radioactive facility that needs to be decommissioned. The other reactor, TMI-1, just came offline in September. So you have two reactors that are not functioning, owned by two separate companies with two separate decommissioning formulas. TMI-2 is now saying they're ready to be cleaned up after a 40-year delay, and TMI-1 is saying we're not ready to be cleaned up and we're going to wait till 2072. And in the middle of all this, the NRC is emphasizing telework or telecommunicating, and there's just no way to transfer fuel, build a cask, clean up a plant when everybody dials it in. It's just not practical. And we were looking for some idea of where the industry is going today, and where the industry is going is to do as little as much.
To do as little as much?
When I say as little as much, you need boots on the ground. I mean, Exelon, which owns TMI-1, is based in Illinois. The regional headquarters is in King of Prussia, and the plant is in central Pennsylvania. You need to physically have people on the ground at 3 Mile Island to essentially get approval and construct dry cask. TMI Unit 1 is all spent fuel pools. There's no dry cask storage. So we have to build the cask, and you can't do it remotely. And TMI-2 is on the verge of being sold by a company, First Energy, which is based in Ohio, to a company that's based in Utah. At some point, we have to end this virtual nuclear reality and actually have people here, Libby, at 3 Mile Island to do the work, to do the groundwork, to do the actual work. And right now, we have serious concerns about site access. People would have to be coming and going all the time to accomplish these tasks.
And with the pandemic, and not knowing what the duration is going to be, what the severity is going to be. But from my perspective, if a prediction is dire, I'm more likely to believe it than somebody patting my head and saying, don't worry about it. So it seems like it's going to be quite a while before it's even feasible to get those people on the ground there. Given the current circumstances, from your perspective, what, if anything, would be a feasible, if not an ultimately acceptable solution to where we are right now?
I think we need to take a time out, and we need to hit the reset button. Rather than facilitate and expedite exemptions for the industry, I think we need to take a step back and examine what we're doing. I mean, immediately the concern should be plants that are due for refueling have to have operation and maintenance tests. I think the industry is going to ask and get granted exemptions and defer a lot of necessary maintenance. For plants like ours that are in no man's land, I think the best action scenario is a no action scenario. Just hit the timeout button until we get a grasp on the virus. Look, one of the problems with both refueling and decommissioning plant is you're going to need people from other parts of the country coming and going, and I just don't think that's prudent at this point. And that's a challenge for refueling. So if you're asking me, I would not only hit the timeout button, I don't think there's the need for the amount of energy that we thought we needed just a month ago. And one of the callers, I believe it was Kevin Kamps, suggested targeted reactor shutdowns. There's areas of the nation where energy production is not going to be as necessary as it once was. So, it'd be nice to err on the side of caution rather than trying to ram through the process. So, look, it's a first meeting today. It wasn't a good meeting. The signs are pretty disturbing, but, that's why we're all out here. Safety groups, reactor communities, media, whatnot, to try and bring the process under control, Libby. That's why it's so important you do the show.
I'm not going anywhere in more ways than one, but fortunately the show is and will continue to hone in on any issues where the pandemic and nuclear cross each other.
Well, look, you have an intersection at 3 Mile Island of a pandemic and a scary history, and we actually thought today and suggested that perhaps the NRC could look at lessons learned so they don't make the same mistakes twice.
What a silly thought.
I guess, obviously the agency and the industry is historically illiterate. We spent tens of millions of dollars, and there's countless studies and pages of how not to enter a crisis period the way we're entering a crisis period. We're making the same mistakes, and it's disappointing, but, we know where we're at. We know what we have to do, and we've been here since 1977. We're certainly not going anywhere. Doesn't sound like you're going anywhere, so, we'll soldier forward.
Glad to be on the front lines with you, Eric.
Eric Epstein of 3 Mile Island Alert. Again, a reminder that this Saturday, March 28, marks the 45th anniversary of the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident, the day that changed my life forever and the lives of so many others. You can learn more about them on the Facebook site 3 Mile Island Survivors.
Activist, shout out.
Even with the Olympics postponed, if not canceled, there are still relevant issues that need to be addressed. And to that end, on Thursday, the 26th of March, there's going to be a webinar entitled Radiation and the 2020 Olympics. It's being put on by Boston University School of Theology, Faith, and Ecological Justice. It will feature talks by two of our top experts, Norma Field, who works extensively with Japan, and Marco Kaltofen of the Worcester Polytechnic Institute. In light of the postponement of the Olympics, I emailed Norma to ask whether the webinar would still go forward and if the information shared would be the same. And she explained that because of how they framed the conversation, all the information remains valuable and will possibly be added to. To quote from the official flyer, "The risk of radiation exposure and health threats continues regardless of the postponement. The 2020 Tokyo Olympics concerns everyone who joins the global festival where we celebrate humanity in unity." And this is whether it takes place in Japan later in 2020, in 2021, or any other time. Back to the flyer. Furthermore, the concern does not stop with the closing ceremony of the Tokyo Olympics. The presentations by Dr. Norma Field and Dr. Marco Kaltofen will cover the reality of radioactive contamination in Japan, focused on Tokyo and Fukushima, and the risk of radiation exposure. Still important information, and we will, of course, have a link up to that webinar on our website, nuclearhotseat.com, under this episode, number 457. Note that we do not yet know whether this is going to be recorded or not. I'm hoping so, but if not, live may be the only way that you can get the information. Here's today's final thought. Stupefying. That so much has happened so quickly to change our lives. The very fabric of our existence is being torn apart by the coronavirus. And given the potential impact to the nuclear industry that is clearly not receiving the oversight or attention that it deserves, things will become nothing but worse. And I don't know that it can ever get better. Sorry, except not really, if this is depressing. But I think those of us who deal with nuclear issues are used to looking at long-term consequences and extrapolating out to ultimate conclusions. That makes us uniquely qualified to be out of denial about what we're facing with COVID-19. And now, looking at the nuclear dangers posed by this pandemic, it's all unprecedented and really scary. Anything else I say on this would be redundant, as I'm certain each of you has your own thoughts and fears. But there's something else that I'd like to share, something new, a revelation that I came across a few days ago, and my jaw is still dropped from it. Full disclosure, I love to work anagrams. For those of you who are not familiar with anagrams, that's the scrambling of letters in a word or phrase to come up with another word or phrase, hopefully one that is relevant. Some of the more famous ones, Clint Eastwood anagrams out to Old West Action. And public relations, the anagram of public relations is crap built on lies. It's a little game that I like to play with names, titles, all kinds of things. It costs nothing, and it endlessly amuses me. Well, a few nights ago I thought, I wonder what the anagram of coronavirus is. So I put it into the online program that I use, and I couldn't believe it because I discovered that the anagram of coronavirus is carnivorous. And what is this novel virus doing? It is being carnivorous, eating our lives, devouring our way of life, ripping apart the fabric of all we believe and count on, down to our muscles, our sinews, getting ready to crack our bones. I have a lot of beliefs about anagrams and what they reveal to us, which I don't need to get into here. Just know that I consider this significant. And I couldn't come up with it and not share it with you. So feel free to pass it along. The anagram of coronavirus is carnivorous. And please, if you do pass it along, I'd appreciate it if you would source it back to me, Libby Halevi, and nuclearhotseat.com. Maybe if it gets out, it will help direct people back here to consider the larger issues posed by this program. This has been Nuclear Hot Seat for Tuesday, March 24th, 2020. Material for this week's show has been researched and compiled from nuclear-news.net, deunrenard.wordpress.com, Beyond Nuclear, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN, japantimes.co.jp, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, 3 Mile Island Alert, Bologna.com, power-technology.com, BBC, The Guardian, Aiken Standard, tri-cityherald.com, oakridgetoday.com, Reuters, dailycause.com, Nuclear Watch New Mexico, the Sierra Club, ESPN, NHK, Mainichi.jp, thejapannews.com, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Thanks for episode assistance from longtime listeners Bruce Brinkman and Bill Smyrno. And thanks to listeners around the world who keep me informed as to what the nuclear situation looks like from your perspective. Nuclear Hot Seat is on all the major podcast platforms, but if you want it delivered immediately to your inbox, your email, go to nuclearhotseat.com, scroll down to the yellow box, actually it's a band across now, and put in your name and email address. You'll get one email a week with the link to the show and a brief summary of what is involved in it. This episode of Nuclear Hot Seat is copyright 2020, Libby Halevi and Heartistry Communications. All rights reserved, but fair use allowed as long as proper attribution is provided. This is Libby Halevi of Heartistry Communications, the heart of the art of communicating, reminding you that once you know the truth about nuclear and the dangers it poses, how can you possibly not be against it? That's it. You've had your nuclear wake-up call yet again this week. So don't go back to sleep, because we are all in the nuclear hot seat.
Nuclear hot seat. What are those people thinking? Nuclear hot seat. What have those boys been drinking? Nuclear hot seat. The corium is sinking. Our time to act is shrinking, but our activists are linking. Nuclear hot seat. It's the bomb.